Hello, and welcome to the August Institute for Liberal Values Lab, entitled Classical Education Properly Understood is Inexorably Radical, Not Conservative. David Steiner, Dr. David Steiner is with us today. He is the Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and Professor of Education at Johns Hopkins University. In 2020, he finished serving as a member of the Maryland State Board of Education and the Maryland Commission for Innovation and Excellence in Education. He is currently serving on the board of the Relay Graduate School of Education. He previously served as Commissioner of Education for New York State and as the Clara and Larry Silverstein Dean of the Hunter College School of Education, and also as Director of Education of the National Endowment of the Arts. And that I'm stopping the reading of the biography now. It does go on. So welcome, Dr. David Steiner. Please, I'm looking forward to hearing what classical education is and how it is inevitably radical, not conservative.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to start with a quotation from the great novelist and essayist Franz Kafka. And I'm quoting now, translating, of course, from the German. I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound or stab us. If the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? So that it will make us happy? Good Lord, we would be happy precisely if we had no books. And the kind of books that make us happy are the kind we could write ourselves if we had to. But we need books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. That is my belief, close quote. I begin with that because to some degree, I think that classical literature, understood at least as I'm going to suggest it might be understood, is the axe that breaks the frozen sea within us. In other words, the reason we still read texts 2,400 years later is because, as Ezra Pound once wrote about literature, they are news that stays news. They don't grow old. And they don't grow old because fundamentally they are that axe. They break us. They intervene in ways we can never quite get rid of once we've wrestled with them. What do I mean by the frozen sea inside us? Let's talk about education. Education, the simple word educare, means not to constrain or mold or determine or lock in place. Quite the opposite. Educare means to draw out. Education draws me out of myself. It draws me out of myself so that I can learn to think. Animals can reproduce, build houses. They can even have memory, show sadness. But one thing they can't do that we can is to think. When it comes to thinking, at the heart of thought is the dialogue between me and myself. Much of my life will be spent in solitude. Yes, I'm going to mix with family, with friends, with others, but in the end, thought is really something done alone. Thought is something that exists as a dialogue between me and myself. So great works of classical literature, I would suggest, are breaking into that dialogue, informing that dialogue, disturbing that dialogue, above all, raising questions that in my thought I cannot quite get rid of. I continue to wrestle with them because they are fundamental, because they're inescapable, because they speak to the most essential aspects of what it is to be human. And ultimately, because they remain disturbing. And that is why I think they are radical rather than conservative. Conservative suggests stasis. It concerns preservation, preserving a set of beliefs, preserving a way of life. And today, many, many parents, both of the left and the right, I think are deeply invested in that sense of education, in passing on, in preserving their own particular beliefs and trying against all odds, against social media, against whatever it may be, to preserve their own beliefs and pass them on to their children. And again, I want to stress, this is not just the left or the right, it's both. It's all of us. But it seems to me that education, properly understood, is quite different from that. It is, in fact, to disturb, it is to awake, it is to arouse thought. And to enable thought, fundamentally, is inseparable from enabling freedom. Because without thought, there is only automatic pursuits of hobbies and habits, of beliefs that have been passed down to us, of social norms. We'll come back to that. Not much space for genuine freedom. The genuine freedom of a human being is the right to think differently, to think for oneself. And to do that, that thought must be informed. What does it mean to encounter texts that don't provide answers, but that rather invite us into a dialogue with insolubles? That is the radical invitation of the classics, or so I will argue. Let's start at the beginning with Homer. Homer's depiction of Achilles is, I would suggest, profoundly disturbing. Achilles, at one level, is a warrior brute. He kills. That's what he does best, and he does it again and again and again. After the death of his beloved Patroclus, he comes across a young member of King Priam's family from Troy, a young man who realizes who he's up against Achilles. The young man's name is Lycaon, Lycaon. Lycaon grovels and begs Achilles to spare him. He tries to argue that he's not closely related to Hector, that he thought Patroclus was a wonderful character. He says, "Don't kill me. I'm not from the same womb as Hector, the one who killed your friend." Achilles turns on him and says, and I'm quoting from the Greek in translation, "Come, friend, you too must die. Why moan about it? Even for me, Achilles, death is waiting." Close quote. Achilles then slaughters the young man. It's a horrible scene with the young man begging for mercy and essentially being then executed, put to death by this brute Achilles. And yet Achilles is the same character who meets with Priam, the king of that he's been fighting for 10 years, the king of Troy, after Achilles kills Priam's son Hector. The two of them meet in Achilles' tent, and Achilles breaks down in tears of empathy for the old man, embraces him, invites him to eat, saying that despite the terrible grief they're both feeling, he, Achilles, for his friend, Priam for his son, they must dine together, they must understand each other, and ultimately Achilles agrees to honor and to preserve the body of Hector. The complexity of a character of that kind, the refusal of Homer to create anything simple, has resonated from that day to this. My father has written about the death camps, the Jewish death camps, and has pointed out that officers of the SS could gas Jews during the day and then listen to Schubert and Mozart and Beethoven with genuine appreciation for that music in the evening. How is it possible for a human being to be both brute and empathizer, both the source of horror and poetry, both a person who can be completely sadistic and yet can be empathetic, sensitive, and aesthetically appreciative? We don't know the answers to those questions, but it was Homer who asked them, and his question remains. We move on to Plato's Socrates. You will recall, of course, that Socrates is found guilty of misleading the youth of Athens and of impropriety and of disbelief in the gods, and is thrown in jail, awaiting the day when he will be asked to take the hemlock and essentially to take his own life. We know from other accounts that the Athenians very well expected Socrates to escape from jail, and his own friends, Crito particularly, had the money to bribe the guards and basically begged Socrates to escape. Why would this old man sit there and allow himself essentially to die? Socrates, in the final texts of his life, always written, of course, by Plato, Socrates wrote nothing himself. Socrates argues that he cannot escape the punishment of Athens. It would be wrong, because he is who he is because of the city he's been brought up in and has lived in and taught in. That it would be wrong to contravene Athens' laws because he is an Athenian. And yet at the same time, Plato wants us to understand there's a second lesson that Socrates is offering, the lesson of what it means to be the ultimate teacher. A lesson that Jesus of Nazareth will make, of course, his own in a very different way. And that is that there are times when the ultimate sacrifice is required to bring fundamental truths to others who cannot otherwise understand them. That is to say that Socrates, by being willing to die the unjust death that is his, to take the hemlock, despite every opportunity to avoid it, is shaming Athens, is confronting Athens with its own absolute inhumanity, its own miscarriage of justice, in a message that will resonate from that day to this. How can both lessons be true? Again, a profoundly disturbing question. How can it both be true that Socrates refuses to undo his Athenian identity while damning that Athenian identity as fundamentally having been corrupted and rendered unjust? Questions that remain again to this day. When Robert E. Lee was asked at the beginning of the Civil War to fight for both the North and the South, both sides wanted him, he faced this question: who was he? To whom did he owe allegiance? And there is some evidence that he understood that in a more eternal sense, the cause of the North may have been the more moral, the more ethical, the more just. And yet he decides to fight for the South because he is a Virginian and cannot be otherwise, no matter at some level the justice or injustice of the Southern cause. That is a direct descendant, if you will, of the radically destabilizing lesson that Socrates gives us at the end of his life. We move on to Aristotle. Are we willing to take Aristotle seriously when he argues and tries to teach us in the Politics that democracy is a fundamentally corrupt regime. What more radical teaching could there be than that? In Aristotle's view, in a democracy, the majority, the poor, who are the majority, will rule in their own interests, not in the interests of the whole. And, says Aristotle, democracies, the majority, are deeply vulnerable to exploitation by populist leaders or demagogues who know how to appeal to their emotions and their immediate interests rather than their sound reasoning and long-term thought. Plato, by the way, clearly had the same view, but Aristotle puts it in very clear, succinct terms. He believed that democracy was essentially a corrupt regime that was unstable by definition and did not serve and could not serve the interests of all, but would be seduced by the power of the few and end up in tyranny of one kind or another. Are we willing to accept that teaching, at least to engage with it seriously, and not simply in some knee-jerk way say, oh, you know, three hurrahs for American democracy, three hurrahs for democracy. As Churchill said, it's a terrible system, but it's just better than anything else. Maybe we should ask some fundamental questions with Aristotle about the nature of a democratic regime and what happens to democratic regimes in the hands of demagogues and leaders who are willing to manipulate it. We also tend to think about Aristotle as our teacher when it comes to conservative values and ethics and morals, right? So we turn to Aristotle and Nicomachean ethics because we think, right, he's going to teach us about virtue, the conservative values of virtue. Actually, if we read Aristotle rather than sort of bad summaries of Aristotle, what we find is that Aristotle argues again and again at some length that it is quite useless to teach children to be virtuous, that in fact they cannot possibly understand what virtue is. Indeed, for Aristotle, understanding what virtue is reserved for the very few and after a lifetime of study. Instead, what Aristotle says is we must habituate children to acting virtuously without understanding why they're doing it. We have to habituate them to actions that are, as it were, become muscle memory, that are unconscious, that are thoughtless, that are in some ways indoctrination, so that one day they may have the opportunity to avoid what Aristotle calls akrasia, or weakness of the will. Akrasia is the great poison. It is the poison that comes from staring at social media for 8 hours a day. It is the poison that comes from being slothful or being, as it were, it's deeper than laziness. It's a kind of inability anymore to focus, to discipline oneself. And the only solution to avoiding that for Aristotle is habituation. The Spartans understood the same thing. Their goal was different. They wanted to make young men into warriors, into Spartan warriors. They didn't try to teach them why Sparta was virtuous. They trained them, right, to be physical specimens who were immune from physical pain by habit, by instinctive habit. Are we still willing to pay that price in a culture which, frankly, with helicopter parents, with indulgence, with grade inflation, with deep worry about, how people feel and all the rest of it, are we really willing to take Aristotle seriously and habituate our children to self-discipline? That is today a radical thought, not a conservative one. And we have to think about it. Again, it's disturbing. It's disturbing to think that we have to create unconscious, almost robotic actions in our children if we're going to preserve them. The great Swiss philosopher, political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau, many centuries after Aristotle, of course, made the same lesson in his great pedagogical novel, Emile, where he said, "Let your commands be invisible, but walls of bronze." Right? So the idea is that the tutor of the young boy constructs the boy's experience so that his habits will show him the results of bad behavior and good behavior. But the tutor has organized it all. The tutor has organized the world to create those self-reinforcing habits that the tutor wants to see. We move on now to a text that is deeply conservative in most people's readings, used in classical education schools, so forth and so on, St. Augustine. I mean, what could be more conservative than St. Augustine? Well, of course, again, and I don't want to sound in any way patronizing here, but reading St. Augustine is actually very rarely done. Most people pull a few quotes, and that's it. And that's not surprising. It's very, very dense textually. It's very difficult. The theological debates are opaque, to put it mildly. But if you actually read some of the texts, particularly the difficult texts about predestination and free will, what you discover is quite horrifying in some ways and very radical. What you discover is the fundamental Augustinian argument that by choosing wrongly, Adam and Eve have abandoned free will completely, both for themselves, but more terrifying than for themselves, for all of humanity, for all of humanity. So that we live now, according to St. Augustine, in that permanent state of akrasia that Aristotle was trying to rescue children from. It's too late. For St. Augustine, original sin means that we are in a state of akrasia. We've lost the power of self-determination. Think about that for a moment, right? That we have lost the power of virtuous free will. We may be saved, says St. Augustine, by the grace of God, but we cannot know that God has chosen to visit us with that grace. We may be living in predestined sin, inescapable predestined sin. Are you ready to think about that thought? Are you willing to sustain that thought, what that means? Today, it's rare to take seriously that debate about predestination. But for the debate for the Protestants, for example, who came much later, it was life and death. It was absolutely a fundamental question of whether you could know that you were saved, or whether, in fact, you had to act as if you hoped you were saved, which is an incredibly complicated and destabilizing thought. Right? I'm going to act as if I thought I am being saved while knowing that I can't know it. That is hardly a conservative thought. It's a thought of enormous courage, enormous faith, enormous gamble on the will of the Lord, which must remain opaque to me for the whole of my life. I can never know. I can never know. Augustine struggles mightily with what that means for the self, right? What is the self? What are his dreams? Is he guilty when he dreams about sex, when he has these illicit dreams? Who is he? What is he responsible for? Again, great classical texts go on ringing down the centuries. Many centuries later, Sigmund Freud would wrestle with Augustine's question, right? Are we guilty of our dreams? Augustine, evidently, in the end, tends to say no, because we can't decide which of those dreams come from God, right? And which don't. Freud says absolutely. He says, in the depths of my heart, I can't help being convinced that my dear fellow men, with few exceptions, are worthless, because he sees what the subconscious is capable of. And he says, obviously, I'm quoting Freud now, obviously one must hold oneself responsible for the evil impulses of one's dreams. In what other way can one deal with them? Well, you really want to be invited to be responsible ethically for your dreams? Not a conservative thought there. Not a conservative thought at all. Let's look at the great books through the eyes of some extraordinary African Americans that we read today. I'm going to just take three: Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. Now, as you know, each of them went through incredibly difficult experiences. We think mostly of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. We forget that Malcolm X was also in jail. We forget, right? We probably don't forget what Frederick Douglass went through and the slavery and the agony. But fewer people remember that each of those three men chose to teach themselves the classics. In the case of Frederick Douglass, he read Bleak House, Dickens, right? He read Shakespeare's Macbeth. It's a long list. Martin Luther King's education at Boston University, elsewhere, of course, brought him a lot of reading, but his letter from the Birmingham jail deeply interrogates Plato's Socrates, Martin Buber's existentialism. Meanwhile, Malcolm X, who literally has to teach himself to read, right, is reading Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Shakespeare's Macbeth again, right? They're not reading these great classical texts because they're conservative. I can promise you that, right? They're reading them because of the deep, fundamentally unsettling insights that those texts provide. And I want to go into one example from Nelson Mandela, the great apartheid fighter, the fighter against apartheid in South Africa, who then, of course, many years after his jail sentence becomes president of South Africa. When he is first put in jail, this is in Robben prison, and he's expecting to spend much of his life there. In fact, he ends up spending 18 years, which is hardly a short period. But he's in jail, and it's time for picking the Christmas play. The prisoners are allowed to put on a play. Now, remember, they're all male, they're Africans, and they could pick anything. Right? I mean, they could pick from their own culture, they could pick stories, they could write their own. And what does Nelson Mandela persuade all of his fellow prisoners to choose? Sophocles' Antigone. And why does he choose Sophocles' Antigone? Because he wants to act the role of both Antigone and Creon. Antigone, the young woman who is the daughter of the king, who insists on burying her rebel brother, despite the fact that he turned against the state. Her father is furious and wants that brother's body to lie for the vultures. And Creon, who decrees that the boy be left to the vultures, ultimately ends up imprisoning and killing his own daughter, Antigone. In thinking about that text, the reason, and we know this from later commentary, the reason Nelson Mandela picks it is simply because he came to believe that Antigone, the play, had more to teach him about fundamentals of gender, rule, power, ambition, fear, sacrifice, love, family, than any other text he could imagine. And not because, and this is my fundamental point, not because it solved those problems. It doesn't say at the end, oh, wow, well, Antigone was right, okay, and stupid Creon. And it doesn't say, oh, Creon was right, state power, the maintenance of peace and order, the individual conscience has to give way to it. The point is that Sophocles refuses to enable us to do anything but wrestle with that fundamental tension, which is with us to today, right? For those who object to a political regime, whether it's our current regime or any other political regime, where do you draw the line? At what point do you say no? At what point are you willing to be imprisoned? Right? Do you have an answer to that question? It's a radical question because it asks you, what are the limits of your conscience? What are you not willing to stay silent about? Where is the limit of your courage? Have you asked yourself the question that Sophocles asked 24, 25 centuries ago? Or are you just going to stay asleep with the frozen lake of your mind and no ice axe? Right? This is the question. When Antigone, the play, asks us about courage, faith, family, state power, pride, gender, mortality, if you're willing to read it, if you are willing to think about it, it will make current questions inescapable. Inescapable. That is not stasis. That is not conservation. That is fundamentally, potentially radical, because it invites you to destabilize yourself, your community, your world, as Nelson Mandela, of course, did. Right? He took the prison sentence. He took the risks of fighting against the regime, and he could not know, as a young man put in jail, that he would ever see the light of day. But studying Antigone, he understood what the stakes were. He understood what the stakes were. I think that this fundamental gift of the classics means that it would be artificial to draw a line between the ancient classics and the modern classics or the 19th century classics. For me, the word classic simply means that it is news that remains news. Texts remain classical texts because they ask the fundamental questions. We may turn away from Karl Marx because we think, well, it's not a classic. Well, sorry. The questions that Karl Marx asks, for example, in the 1859 preface, are as deep as the questions that Sophocles asked. And that's why that text is a classical text for me. It's not because it's left-wing. I can talk equally powerfully about Carl Schmitt and the right on the same grounds. But what Karl Marx asks us to think about is whether the material conditions that enable us to have the homes we live in, to have the technology we use every day, to live the lives of consumption that we live. He asks whether it, as a question, could it not be that our relationship to those material forces are far more shaping of our thought, of our behavior, than we're willing to countenance? His successor, in many ways, Michel Foucault, the great French sociologist, pushes that question very hard and says, look, the very word a subject, right? As someone who grew up in England, I know about being Her Majesty's subject, right? And the word being a subject, but also subjectio, subject to, being subject to. Foucault and Marx ask us, to what degree are we really our own subject? To what degree, as an academic, a Jew, an American, am I already subjugated? Am I not scripted? Am I constituted by these networks such that the space of my freedom may be much narrower than I think? And to what degree am I willing to interrogate those constraints that come from the conditions of society and social structure and material structure and economic structure? It's trivial and really trashy to say, oh, I'm free. It's too easy. What does freedom mean if 99% of your waking hours, your choices of how you dress, what you speak to, how you behave, could be predicted simply by knowing your subjectivities, the powers and forces that you are subject to? Great classical texts problematize that situation. They ask us to think about it, not simply to accept it. Foucault writes, I have sought to study in my current work the way a human being turns himself into a subject. Power relations are rooted deep in the social nexus, not from above. His point is, it's not as simple as looking for somebody who's telling me what to do. As an academic, there are a whole huge number of norms that constrain the way I behave. And most days, most hours of most days, I don't even know it. I'm just a subject to forces I'm not interrogating. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the most radical texts, the classical texts, are the most inescapable if taken seriously. I quote from Matthew 5:29-30. This is the King James Version. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. I ask you, are you willing to take that text seriously? It's not a rhetorical question. If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out. Right? Matthew 5:29. That Christ's message, take all thou hast and give it to the poor, is about as radical as anything one can imagine. For Jews, it was an incredibly radical message to say, let the dead bury thy dead. That there could be no more heinous attack on Jewish Talmudic law than what this young Jewish prophet was saying. Christ's words are very disturbing, deeply disturbing. I want to close by arguing that today's education system has made these conversations especially difficult. We are an incredibly heterogeneous society, fantastically, wonderfully heterogeneous. We've tried to do something that almost no other nation's ever tried to do, which is to build a nation out of peoples from all over the world, many creeds, colors, faiths. But we're frightened, therefore, understandably perhaps, of imposing narratives of stories, of agreeing on what's worth teaching. And instead we try to teach the skills. So instead of saying, let's read The Great Gatsby, The Bluest Eye, Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn, whatever your text may be, we say, let's find the main idea in a text that's not going to disturb anybody. Let's just read for comprehension. Let's try to bypass content and just teach the skills. And then we wonder why nobody reads. And we wonder why people can't read very well. The reason that you can find the main idea, by the way, as a 16-year-old in a passage is because you know what the darn passage is about. Not because there's some mystical skill called find the main idea. There is a body of literature that has survived famine, world wars, disease, empires collapsing, empires emerging, little pieces of papyrus with poems from Sappho, fragments from Heraclitus, plays from Sophocles, statements from a person who never wrote them down, Socrates. For some reason, the human being in a jail in South Africa knows that those texts are worth reading. Seems very hubristic, doesn't it? That we do not. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I do have some questions from the audience here. So I'm reading them for the first time. So hopefully,
please.
Yes. So outside of reading and understanding classical texts, what does classical education entail? So you focused really on, on the reading.
Yeah.
What else?
That's a great question. So I think it absolutely entails the entire range of aesthetic experience, which means music and poetry and painting, visual as well as oral. It seems to me the same criteria apply. That is, the reason why we continually look at a Caravaggio or a Leonardo or a Michelangelo is not simply because we're told to. It's because generations who have done so have been impacted fundamentally by doing so in a way that looking at my drawing on the back of last night's napkin after dinner just ain't going to do it, right? It just isn't going to do it. There is a difference, whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not, there is a difference. And for once, by the way, the market, which is the most unsentimental, you might say, the least philosophical of any agency we have, understands this, right? When a painting by Gauguin of a bunch of figures playing cards goes for $260 million, or a Rothko goes for 50 million, it's not accidental, right? The value that the market is putting on these great canvases reflects something, that those canvases communicate to us over the generations. That's why some art is priceless, right? The same with music, right? I'm not saying that if you take someone who's never heard classical music and you play Mozart, that they'll immediately say, oh my God, right? This is unbelievable. There has to be a certain amount of education, a certain amount of attunement. But when the Count sings his aria of asking the Contessa to forgive him in The Marriage of Figaro, and the Contessa forgives him knowing he will do it all over again, and Mozart somehow captures that in the music, it's inescapable. Once you've heard it with thoughtfulness, you never forget it, just as you never forget her first solo aria at the end of the first act. Those pieces of music, Bach's B minor Mass, Mozart's operas, Beethoven's symphonies, and other things for other people, other kinds of music. I am told, for example, that there are great Indian composers, I mean Indian subcontinent composers, and I don't have the education yet to hear that music. I hear it, but it doesn't
move you.
Aesthetically, right, yeah. Be moved. So absolutely, your questioner is right. Classical means news that stays news, whatever format that comes in, architectural, musical, artistic, literary.
Okay, so I got to go to the next question here. Hang on. If not for classical education, how would you describe the current state of education? What is non-classical education?
Great question. I would define it as education for utility. That is to say, we want, rightly, young people to grow up in a way that enables them to make a living, not to go to jail, to vote, presumably, though I'm not so sure about that. That is to say, we want a pragmatic education. We don't want them asking too many fundamental questions. We want them to essentially behave and to be productive citizens, which is perfectly legitimate, of course. But I think ultimately the problem is that at some deep level, we produce people who may be very boring to themselves. Because when they have to be alone, what's up here? What is the furnishing of the mind? Right? I mean, if it seems to me after 2,400 years of history, we owe young people a bit more than that, right? We owe them to offer them the best of our inheritance, not just, how to do software. The problem with utility education is that it doesn't work very well, right? There are big pieces in the New York Times recently and other papers about how programmers, people who took all these courses, right, to be software engineers, AI is putting them out of work. These jobs are disappearing. We tried to teach them skills rather than knowledge. And in the end, they're going to have to be reskilled and reskilled and reskilled. And none of that, in my view, is worthy of the name education. It's technical training, which is important, but not the same thing.
And they do really resent us as college professors. And, I'm sure you face the same thing when we ask them to think deeply.
Yes, well, that's Aristotle's point, because they haven't been habituated to reading a long text, right? I mean, even anything beyond a paragraph, which is what social media presents to them, is now painful. Right. I mean, French students who wanted to go to university a few years ago they still have to do this. They write a general paper with no notes. So it's just them, their head and their pen for 4 hours. And one of the topics was, what would persuade you that rocks feel pain? Now, I try to imagine our 17-year-olds with just a paper and a pencil, right? I mean, no, they couldn't, because they haven't been trained to think, to put together the humanities, the sciences, the psychology, the whatever. And so, of course, they're resentful if we try to make them. It's too late. That's Aristotle's point, right? It's much too late.
Yeah, it really is. And of course, psychology would agree with Aristotle that, that so much of this has to be habitual. And that's not the same thing as skilled, right?
Right.
And I think that
that's right. I mean, skill is something that you learn to do, right? Very self-consciously, right? I mean, become a better tennis player means throw the ball up, make sure it goes more straight, higher, right? Skills are self-consciously developed. The idea ultimately is that they become less self-conscious.
They become
They become habitual. But for children, it's not that way. For children, it's just, let me give you a very precise example. I've had the experience of being very agonized when young people refuse to get out of bed and they're late for school. Right? It's a very many parents will have had that experience. As a child, I was never late for school. That's not because I was virtuous. It's because the thought of being late for school never was possible. It was not an available thought to me. It wasn't that I thought, oh, could I be late? No, my dad will get cross at me. I'm going to get to school on time. It's not a conceivable option, right? That's habituation.
Yep.
And reading for me, and I was very lucky in that regard, was habituation, right? It was every evening. We had a little black and white TV in a tiny room that was bloody uncomfortable. We were allowed one program every 3 days or something like that. The rest of the time we read. That's what we did.
Right. And yeah, I'm with you. Like it never occurred. Like I can remember being, sort of being afraid of certain things, like, being late or whatever. And no one ever asked me, what are you afraid of? Or helped me figure out what I was afraid of. They wanted me afraid. Being afraid, it's like, that was fine.
Fear is a very good educator. But the best education of all is the one you don't know you're getting.
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, I mean, nobody, I'm with you. Nobody really asked me or anything. Why do you think, I can give some, psychology behind this, but why is it that you think culturally right now, we are so reluctant to do this entertaining of other possible selves. There's a whole,
Yep.
psychological literature on possible selves
Yep.
and how valuable they are for all kinds of reasons. But we have sort of developed now a habit, if you will, of not doing that.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And Christopher Lasch, of course, wrote famously on the culture of narcissism. But I think the point here is that, and here I do think liberalism went terribly wrong. Identity politics became uncontrolled to the point where each of us feels like we mustn't be disturbed in who we are, that somehow, however bizarre, however weird, however whatever, or boring we happen to be, because we are that person and define ourselves that way, everyone else has to back off, right? They have to treat us with kid gloves. It's almost like there's something in the American Constitution now, a right not to be offended.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There is no such right, right? I mean, being offended is part of growing up. Being challenged to be different than who you are is part of maturity, right? But we're also afraid of disturbing the identity of each other, that our shells are hardening and we're bristling with spears, right? We're on the lookout for anyone who's going to do this to our child, or my goodness, give them a text that I don't like. That's called education, right? That's called drawing out. That is called challenging and creating thought, the space for thought, right? Education should be all about being disturbed over time by ideas you had never entertained before. But more and more, we want education to just rubber stamp who we think we are as parents, right? Our identity, not yours, not yours. We're more and more offended at the idea of public education because that means I'm sharing this experience with others who are different. Oh my goodness, right? And I might have to read something that they love and I don't. And oh my goodness, right? I want that out of the library, out of the library. George Orwell knew all about this, right? Where this ends. This ends in mind control. And it doesn't really matter if it's the parent or the state. It's equally invidious. But I think that this fear of having one's identity upset is relatively recent.
Mm-hmm.
This meism and this sort of bristling animosity at the world, if the world dares, right, to disturb your right over yourself and your children, to sort of draw a shell around them and say, just like I want.
Yeah, I mean, I teach statistics, and one of the identities that these students have is I'm bad at math.
Right.
And they don't even want that challenged.
Right. Yes.
So
right.
I own that.
Leave me alone with my being bad at mathdom, right?
Yes.
Because that's who I am. It's part of who I am, right? And I happen to be dyslexic, right? And when I say that to people in America, they're full of sort of nice concern and, oh my goodness, and you spell your own way. And I say, no, I'm just a bloody bad speller, and I have to memorize the damn words, in good old fashioned Anglo-Saxon English. Again, I don't need to have that respected, right? I need it to be well taught when I'm young, and then let's call a spade, right? But I think our sensitivities have become so fragile that education has become more and more difficult, in the sense of education that I've tried to share this evening, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you read these great texts, they are disturbing, right? At what point do you become Antigone and say no to Creon, right? At what point do you follow Christ and pluck out your eye if it offends you? At what point do you accept that democracies may be fundamentally corrupt regimes? At what point, and so on and so on, at what point are you willing to ask how much of yourself is scripted by the world in which you live and by the
How do we introduce these ideas at a time, because we're trying to do it at the college level and it's flopping.
Yep.
They're staring at us like zombies.
Yep.
Just waiting for the class period to be over so that they can escape before they've had to do it. How can we capture this at a younger age, and start
it's a great question.
Habituate this?
Yeah. I mean, part of the challenge is this. When I ask school teachers, and I have the privilege of a lot of travel across the world, why they went into teaching, right? This is not high school. This is even elementary.
Right.
They say, because I love teaching reading. I love teaching literature. I love teaching science. I love teaching math. When I ask even middle school teachers, but certainly elementary school teachers in America, why did you go into teaching? They say, because I love kids. And that's a fundamental difference, right? Yes. Good teaching, really good teaching, is impossible if you're not passionate about your subject.
Right.
It's very possible. My teachers in England, I went to a state school, but my teachers didn't even know who my first name was. I mean, they called me Steiner. We wore purple, black, and white uniforms. We were ranked 1 to 34 in every class, every semester. And they basically thought their job was to expose us to great stuff. And some of us would make it and some of us wouldn't. And some of us could do the math and some of us couldn't. But fundamentally, they were there because they loved their subject.
Right. So they really treated it more like you and I do at the college level.
Yes.
These are topics that I love. I can remember.
I want to teach you about the ancient Greeks or Romans or Chinese or whatever it may be. I really want to explain to you what an irrational number is. I think it's an amazing thing, right? Isn't it, guys? Because it was all boys' school until the last years. But I think that is a fundamental divide, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we're full of teachers who really care about kids, really do. But we have hundreds of thousands of elementary school teachers who hate math.
Oh, yes. And they're, part of their identity is they're not good at math.
That's right.
And that's why they're being an elementary school teacher.
And that's why
they're not good at math.
32nd in the world in math, among other problems. But we have turned away. I mean, I'll close with this. If you look at the McGuffey readers, the high school readers, these were the most used textbooks of the 19th century in America. There were hundreds of thousands. They were used all over the country. The content of those readers would shame a sophomore literature course at a good university. When Lincoln and Douglas debated in dusty Illinois, wherever, the level of their discussion of the US Constitution and history is well above most sophomores and juniors in American colleges. This is not sentimental. This is just fact, right? That it is also true that education stopped early for many, 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 many Americans, the great majority of them, well into the 19th century. But even the New England primers, the early reading texts were biblical. The middle school, for the kids who stayed in middle school, you look at the McGuffey readers, the content of literature in America is out of all recognition to what we have today. There's some hope with high quality instruction materials that good curriculum are beginning to come back. We've got a long, long, long pathway if we're going to take classical learning seriously once again.
Well, I sincerely hope that you will continue to lead this charge, and we look forward to checking back in with you as things develop. I know you've given me a lot to think about, and I appreciate it very much. Well,
I appreciate you, and I appreciate the audience. And if there are questions, you can find my email at Johns Hopkins. It's d.steiner@jhu.edu. happy to engage further in conversation. Really just want to leave you with the thought that these texts live across the centuries because they ask inescapable questions about who we are, and that's why we should read them.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.